Hello, welcome to All Good Points. I'm Paul North.
I'm George
Hey
McBride.
George, how you doing, matey?
I am good. Happy St. Patrick's Day. We are recording
Happy
this
St. Patrick's Day.
on St.
This
Patrick's
is actually
Day.
the new sugar-free Coke. It's really good. It's really good.
It's not very festive.
It's not very.
though,
It's
is
not
it,
very
Paul?
festive, and it's unusual considering how much Coke I've drunk over the years. But it's super nice. Anyway, we've got a giveaway today. We've got a £50 CiiTech CBD voucher. All you have to do to win a £50 CiiTech C voucher is, well, to be entered into a draw to win a £50 voucher, is comment below on your favourite story that we talk about on today's show. That's it. And you get points to join. You can win a £50 voucher. Thanks to CiiTech. Their details are also in the description below. So big news this week, George. News which has triggered a few people and may continue to trigger people as we talk about it and just going forward. And that is that British American Tobacco heavily invested in Organogram. So they announced a $221 million strategic investment. What are your thoughts on this, George? It's upset a few people online.
It doesn't trigger me, I think.
Shock horror. It doesn't
Shock
trigger
horror.
me. Okay. Didn't see that coming.
As a tobacco and cannabis consumer, I couldn't really, it's not my place to be getting offended by this sort
But
of
some
thing.
people are.
I think
why does it trigger
Yeah.
some people?
I think naturally, because the tobacco industry historically has played some rather underhanded games in minimizing the risk of its own products and attempting to influence regulations to permit sale of very dangerous products. So there's a justifiable reason to be very angry at the tobacco industry. But then viewing the tobacco industry as if it's like a person is the thing that I have a kind of problem with, because it's not, it's not like there's this one guy, like the Marlboro Man, and he's going around screwing everybody over.
They're on
left,
Zoom
right,
calls
and
with me
centre.
every day, and he's just like, right, just go out and do evil. Just keep doing evil.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, it doesn't
Yeah.
quite work like that, does it?
And now they switched and they're selling jazz fags too. To any North American listeners, jazz cigarettes.
You can see the
Jazz
concerns.
cigarettes.
I guess. I mean, you highlighted there that like they're not got the best reputation, the tobacco industry.
No, but then
Like
You know,
you must be able
they
to get the
don't,
concerns.
obviously.
Do you know what I mean? Like you must, because I remember when
yeah.
oh, sorry, of course you get them, but like I remember I was talking to an academic. This was a few years ago. It was at a book launch. Really nice guy. I won't mention his name because he's not here. I don't like paraphrasing characters if they're not on the show, whatever, to correct me when I say it wrong. But I was talking to him about like business versus government, and I was saying why do you have so many fears around business and industry engaged in the space? And they said the difference between criminal gangs and businesses is criminal gangs can't walk and infiltrate the corridors of power. And that was like the premise for him saying, I'd rather see things as they are in the hands of criminal gangs than I would in the hands of industry. And I guess ultimately that goes straight to the heart of the tobacco issue, doesn't it? That they've not got a very good record with lobbying and engagement. They've got quite...
But the governments don't have very good records either. The British government's been responsible for wars and famines and unprecedented slavery and racial discrimination and all sorts of horrible shit. So I'm not a big fan of saying, oh, let's get the government growing and selling weed. And I can see why people aren't a big fan of tobacco getting in, but I'm not really sure. Like in a practical sense, if you are against it, what can actually be done to stop tobacco companies from participating? Because if we're going to continue to legalize cannabis, that's about allowing people to participate in the trade legally. And I think that is an open invitation for people to get involved. And we've also already seen shady characters from all around the world be they ultra high net worths, dodgy hedge funds, you know, people from gambling and tobacco and all sorts of different things all get involved in the cannabis industry. But good, bad, and ugly, it's fair game, is my take. Once it's legal, anyone can get involved. And what if you're going to go and say, okay, tobacco companies can't get involved, they would have ways to get around that, you know? You'd have to, I don't know what kind of regulations or laws you could put in place that would truly stop them from getting into it. Because what if somebody leaves a tobacco company, then sets up a cannabis company? Are they debarred from doing?
And who's making those decisions?
Because of their previous
like,
employment.
What have you got, like a special council of like liberal ethics that just decides whether they like people or not? It kind of takes you down a bit of a weird route, doesn't it? When you start to play out, because I think it's fine for someone to have the initial premise of I've got concerns around an industry which I have ethical issues with investing in the cannabis space. Fine, that's step one. But when it comes to like, what does the world and regulation actually look like if you want to prevent that? It starts getting a bit weird, doesn't it? Because you're right. What would stop a tobacco company? Like if you prevented British American Tobacco investing in the cannabis space, they'd just start They could just start another company that could then where does that end?
If you're going to do
where does that stop?
Yeah. And if you're going to say, oh, well, funds that have been generated from the sale of tobacco can't then go into cannabis, well, then you'd have to have some huge tracing operations involved in figuring out where money's coming from and everything. I think it's just totally unworkable. I'd be really interested, by the way, if any of you think you've seen any workable suggestions to allay fears around the tobacco industry participating in the cannabis industry. I haven't seen any workable suggestions yet, but I would love to.
I just don't know what it'd look like.
But yeah, it is bad, but it's a natural thing because tobacco in most places, most developed countries around the world, tobacco use is declining. Cannabis consumption is increasing in various places, partly fueled by legalization, and people are going to want to get out of a declining market and into a growing one. And that is going to happen. I know I've met loads of the executives at lots of tobacco companies. They're not all like evil Illuminati.
No, everyone
types.
Who works for any business is evil, George. I saw it on Twitter. Someone posted and it said, anyone who profits within businesses are evil. Twitter at the moment is just totally on point.
It must be right.
Like, you just can't go wrong, can you? Just spews out the facts. I guess one thing to put to you is what if, because I think what helps reform is distancing cannabis from perceptions and stigma around the plant to help drive forward reform. So like just showing people the depth of the market, the breadth of the market, and just educating people on the reality of it is helpful. And it certainly is to the detriment of reform here for people to be thinking about like really strong cannabis in joints. Like that's just not really helpful. That's not really a helpful thing. And you know this from working in the reform space. Like you come up against that and people say, oh, everyone's gonna be smoking tobacco with really strong weed in. That's unhelpful. But like, to what extent might the tobacco influence take us down that road? Do you think there'll be an interest of the tobacco industry to encourage consumption of cannabis alongside tobacco? Because in many ways, tobacco and cannabis have gone hand in hand in the West, particularly in the UK, right? Like most people put baccy in their joints. Well, I mean, it would be a joke.
Most people here, yeah. But I think there's simple things to fix that concern in that, you can put regulations in place to ensure that you can't sell products that contain both. And that seems sensible, and I think that's something, that's being done around the world already. So trying to separate cannabis from tobacco and separate the habits is a good thing and something that can be done effectively through legal regulation, I think. Because if you can only sell pure cannabis products, maybe people will start smoking pre-rolls more and they'll stop using tobacco. Lots of people who are already entrenched in their ways will just carry on. But then those newer cannabis consumers, younger people who are just legally able to purchase them, will only be shown cannabis-only products. And then hopefully that habit of co-consumption dies with that cohort as they age, and people shift away from it. But that's separate, isn't it, from the issue about whether we let all these reputedly evil companies continue to profit when they pulled the wool over people's eyes about the harms of tobacco.
Yeah, I guess I'm suggesting there maybe some of the things you practically can do to alleviate concerns or like make sure the optics stay right. Whereas I think there's this misconception that exists where people think, oh, now tobacco's involved, it's all just going to go really evil. You know what I mean? It's that like, but it comes down to that thing that we've talked about previously, is this sort of like anti-industry sentiment that exists amongst the reform space. Like, I just find it a bit.
Companies have two things only. Companies are not immoral multinational companies, but they're amoral, because all they have to do is maximize profits for their shareholders and abide by the law, and those are the two only things that they have to do. But it's one thing more than a cartel has to do, because all they have to do is maximize their profits without any, and their thing, instead of abiding by the law, is not get caught. Yeah. So they do various things. They don't advertise openly because it would mean that they got caught. So I think, the incentives for people to act morally in big business are slim, but that is across the board societal problem. And I think there are some people who kind of want to see cannabis legalization as more a part of a kind of shift in a different way of doing business. And I'm not sure the cannabis issue is a big enough issue to change the whole way the world works.
This is fundamentally what it comes down to. And I think this is where the tension is existing at the moment around reform, particularly amongst the left, around, there is absolutely a need. We talked about this previously. We talked about this the other week. A need for social equity programs. Absolutely. You should definitely be having that conversation. The industry should definitely be demonstrating its worth in that area. But do we need to go as far as creating a completely new system in which nothing we sell and have nothing else in society? Like, why should cannabis have to go to such an extent that it then doesn't look or sold like anything else that's regulated and controlled? Like and I think I mean, that's not to say that, sure, there are arguments for it to do that, but I think when you end up starting going down that route, which initially has good intentions, you end up basically just making a market and experience which isn't that fun, and it's not really focused on the users. So I think this weird paradox happens where a lot of people from a public health perspective start off thinking about the most vulnerable in society and people that are affected by it, and that's where I started. That's a good starting point, and it's a worthwhile part of the debate. But then as you go down the route of what should it look like, you end up doing a flip where like the end result is then also not so great for the people that you originally wanted to chat about, a lot of whom may well be cannabis users or enjoy the cannabis plant. 'Cause the end product ends up being a bit like, well, this is a bit rubbish. So the groups that have been disproportionately affected, there's still an illicit market, and those issues still go on around policing. Like if your end result is a system which isn't good enough for consumers and the illicit market continues, surely the groups that you initially were advocating for are still kind of stuck in that cycle. I mean, you've not eradicated the problem. It just looks different.
Yeah.
And I think the tobacco thing sort of ends up it sits within that again. It's like, not tobacco. And then, but when you start following it through of like, well, what if you don't want them to have anything to do with it, like what does this end up looking like? You end up with basically like no corporate involvement, really heavy government control, and a system like as if the government can ever make selling cannabis fun. Like, what would that look like? Do you know what I mean? Like as if a government can ever make it like, as if a government could ever drive down the illicit market.
No, it'd be like getting you a methadone script, wouldn't it? If the government was doing it, you'd have regular interventions of people trying to tell you to get off it, and you'd be given it, and you'd have to queue up at some predetermined time where there's like 100 other people queuing up, and it's a real sketchy experience for all of you. Yeah. Yeah, I think the concerns with the big tobacco are concerns around, corporate takeover, and in some ways that's
there's Twitter threads from same tweet different day people around corporate capture. You get them all the time.
And in a way that's why it's good that cannabis reform's happening slowly, as in bottom up, with reforms in small areas and then at state level rather than federal level, because it has slowed this progress of big tobacco and other large conglomerates getting involved, but it was never going to stop it. It was always just going to slow it. And then now they are coming in at scale, and they have been for years, to be fair. This is not the first big tobacco deal in the cannabis space. But now nearly all of them are in, the big companies, not Japan Tobacco, I don't think, but most of the others are now in. People have concerns about it, but there is the opportunity for, at the moment still, with cannabis being a very a very disparate market with lots of different small companies and not much large market share between any one company. Yeah. There's still the opportunity for people to build businesses that they really believe in, with a real relationship with their customers and ethical practices, and to try and win out in the long run. And they then get the opportunity to either sell out to those tobacco companies or try and compete with them. I think people probably have a fear that cannabis is going to end up where there's only 5 companies that own the whole supply, but I don't think it'll end
and again,
up that
just
way.
regulate. You can just do sensible regulation to prevent that anyway, can't you? Do you know what I mean? I think that's the end of the spectrum where you can implement policies which are sensible. I know you're good friends with these guys and you've been out there, but like Tantalus Labs are a good example. Like you should definitely have groups, businesses like that have almost like a bit more of a craft type vibe to it, rather than just being the mega corp Tilray Aurora. Very bespoke, got a very unique USP and a brand. I think that there's no reason why we can't have that. And we do have it for alcohol, like craft beer is totally a thing. Like there are loads of independent breweries. Me and you, and anyone could kind of kick off and start a craft brewery. Like why can't cannabis be any different to that? I just think there's...
Yeah. And I don't think when big tobacco companies captured the whole market and controlled it, there was much of an idea that your choices as a consumer was part of your morality. You just bought things that you needed. Yeah. You didn't think, oh, am I supporting a company that acts in the right way? That's a largely newer trend and a growing trend, and something that will hopefully stop people from completely allowing a corporate capture in the cannabis market.
But also to like big up corporates, it's just such an unpopular viewpoint, and like I'm aware that like it triggers people left, right, and centre. But when we went to Canada, and we took the MPs to Canada, we met the mayor of Smiths Falls, who was basically like, Canopy coming to Smith Falls was the best thing that's happened to our town in years. They brought thousands of jobs. They brought an industry. Do you know what I mean? They brought an industry. They brought innovation. There was jobs for loads of people, from the techie, science people, all the way through to manual labour. It was great, and they just turned up en masse, facility, industry. So, like, I mean, that if it's that versus small craft independent breweries, which typically favour sort of like middle class people, normally like white middle class people, why is Canopy rocking up a bad thing? Do you know what I mean? If you imagine Smiths Falls all those years ago, and you had a system by which was like, it's all about the craft breweries, we don't like big corporations coming in, that would have taken ages to get off. Lots of micro sort of farms that take ages to get off the ground. Whereas like sometimes, I know people have fears around corporations and corporate captures, which is fine. Like it's an interesting discussion, but also employ loads of people. Also, you know what I mean? Like that can be an incredibly good thing for towns and cities which need employment and need a wide range of skills, from just manual labour all the way through to more like science innovation side of things. And like, that's not a bad thing at all. That seems like a good thing. That seems like a positive. Seems pretty positive for the town of Smiths Falls.
Yeah. No, I again, we're in agreement.
Yeah, one of us needs to do like role play, a same tweet, different day type person off Twitter. Do you know what I mean? And just keep saying the same thing same thing over and over again. But anyway, I guess it's nuanced, isn't it? But they're like, we're not disregarding legitimate concerns around corporations. You should always sort of back sensible evidence-based regulation, but there is quite a lot of fear-mongering, I think, that exists on the left around it, as much as there's fear-mongering that exists around the right. That's British American tobacco. Yeah. There's a few other little bits that have popped up on the news this week. There's Mexico have progressed a little bit with regards to their calls for legalization. It passed one of the houses, but they've talked about this a lot, haven't they, John? This is like I think we've mentioned this like 3 times.
Yeah, it's never ending. I feel like we're going to have to just say, look, when it's actually passed, we'll talk about it, because it just takes so long.
One day.
It gets closer every time. There are no big hurdles now. It looks imminent, but there'll be a huge implementation. Bear in mind, this is just the bill drafting and then the political debating. Then there's the whole drafting all the secondary regulations, issuing licenses, building a whole civil service infrastructure around the whole system, licensing everything. It's going to take ages. It's going to be good for Mexico. It's going to be very interesting, but yeah, we've talked about it a lot, and it's not quite there
Get there
yet.
eventually. Does this start? The Sun have finally realised that people are selling drugs on Instagram and Snapchat. They did a story called "Sick and Mix." Drug dealers flood Britain with cannabis-laced sweets disguised as Kinder Eggs, Mars bars, and Haribo. And basically, there's people selling like, American cannabis edibles on Instagram and Snapchat. I mean, this has sort of been, we've seen this evolve over the past few years, haven't we? That originally it just started out with like Cali weed and stuff, and you get like you get like branded weed that was obviously produced over there, and sort of making its way over here. But I think that's just the evolution of that, isn't it? That now you're just seeing like the edibles market is now available on the UK illicit market, which kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Like it's a matter of time, sort of thing.
Yeah, well, we said it was going to happen, didn't we? Called it. I knew there'd be a big uptake in, sale of either knockoff American products produced in the UK or ones smuggled over here.
It's not very helpful for us.
It does. No, but then, it won't be. But then, looked another way. A lot of people want cannabis to be illegal so that people aren't selling cannabis sweets to kids. But then you do have to turn around to them and say, well, look, that's what's going on at the moment. That's what we're trying to stop.
That is actually
so
how it is.
We agree with you, and what we're proposing is supposed to be a way to stop this.
The marketing and branding makes it difficult here, doesn't it? Because I think in the States, obviously, there's not a great deal of regulation on the marketing and the branding, and they literally can just copy, like the sour gummies, sour patch, whatever they're called. They can just copy them, and that, like, I was talking to someone about this yesterday, that optically that does cause a few problems here when we're talking about sensible regulation, and they'll look at what's going on in the States and be like, what is that? Like, that really stresses people out here. It's not really, whereas the Canadian optics are a bit better. It's more sensible regulation and packaging stuff, so it's not particularly useful, but I'm afraid there's only going to be more and more of it. Like, as we wrote a report about DM for Details, like, it is incredibly difficult for the police and the social media companies to control and police those platforms. Like, I can't see that being something that they stop anytime soon, despite their intention. It's just, like, how do you prevent that? How do you stop it? It's too difficult to keep on top of. That's the main stuff, George. We've not got loads and loads of stories this week. We've done a tobacco chat. We've done a little. Today there was a story of Dutchy getting a massive investment. They got a big investment. They were valued at 1.7 billion, and they're like a Shopify for cannabis. So you can basically locate a local dispensary and order weed from there, or have it delivered to you, whatever. So there's more sort of big names establish themselves in America, and it again, something else I was chatting to someone about recently is the sort of breadth. Like, when you start to create legal regulated cannabis markets, it's not just cannabis LPs and dispensaries that do well. It's all those associated brands that sit alongside it, from law firms to logistics to kind of like, tech, science and tech. People like coders, people that can then develop interesting websites that can help people navigate the cannabis space. Incredible opportunity. Do you know what I mean?
That's the thing. That's what I often end up saying to people who are, maybe not so minded to legalize cannabis. Is the main thing doesn't change. There's already people growing cannabis and selling it, and there is no shortfall in supply to meet demand. Everyone who wants cannabis and can afford it gets it, really. And the only thing that changes is, all of that ancillary stuff is just a huge boon in job creation for the professional class, which is something that you would think that a lot of people would want, but obviously it's a complicated moral issue, and that's not necessarily, job creation isn't necessarily at the top of mind, but it should be, because it's important. People need jobs.
Definitely. It's a really important frame. I just don't think it's been talked about enough until now, really. Do you know what I mean? Drug reform's always sort of sat in a different spheres, hasn't it? People talked about, equally important frames, but like the innovation and the tech and the science frame interests loads and loads and loads of people who might sort of switch off when some of the other frames have been used for drug legalization, like people should be able to have a choice. Let's not harm people. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, all good points, George.
All good
points all round.
points.
All right, mate. Well, we'll leave it there.
But a quieter week for
a quieter
news
week
this week.
Just one big investment piece, but yeah, quieter. Probably the quietest one we've had, considering when we first started doing it every week. We're like, oh my god, a welcome break.
But when we first started the whole drug reform thing, the BAT deal would have been monster news, front page news.
Yeah, no, it's like, meh.
So times have changed.
Times are changing, George.
People are like, oh, another 200 million of tobacco money in the cannabis industry, eh?
Whatever. Yeah, we'll see what happens next week, mate. You never know. You never know.
Yeah.
Wicked. All right, thanks for watching. Comment underneath to win a £50 voucher, and we'll speak to you next week. We'll see you next week, and I'll speak to you next week, George.